So, Lindsay, first off, despite some of the memes that are going around, this case didn't actually give back any land, right? So what was it about?
This case was a case involving a criminal charge that was brought against a man who was a citizen of the Seminole Nation. The crime occurred in an area that historically had been part of the Muskogee Creek Nation's reservation, but the state of Oklahoma took the position that that land was no longer part of the reservation and hadn't been for over a century. So they arrested him and they prosecuted him, sent him to jail in a state prison, and he objected that he wasn't supposed to be in state prison because the state had no jurisdiction, because in fact the Muskogee Creek Reservation was still intact. And under U.S. law, if a native person, we use the term Indian in federal law down here, if a citizen of a federally recognized Indian nation commits a crime in Indian country, which includes reservations, then they aren't subject to the criminal jurisdiction of states. They're subject to the criminal jurisdiction of the federal government and the tribe. Mm-hmm. And astonishingly, for some people, less so for others, he was successful in persuading the Supreme Court of the United States that, in fact, the Muskogee Creek Nation was still intact. It had been for well over a century, and that meant that the state had to release him effectively for retrial in federal court. So, as you say, no transfer of land, but a re-recognition of Aboriginal jurisdictional rights in a fairly sizable chunk of Oklahoma.
Well, this includes the city of Tulsa now, I guess, being a reservation. What does it mean?
Yeah, so Tulsa, and that was sort of the big argument that the state made. It used the traditional test for determining whether reservations had been disestablished when the reservation lands were turned into individual farms in the late 19th and early 20th century was, is there evidence in the statute that allotted those lands as individual farms that Congress intended to disestablish the reservation? And if there's not, is there something in just the changed demography that would make us want to find that anyway? Like, for instance, there's a giant city with 1 million people in it, including the suburbs, that would then be within the bounds of this tribe's jurisdictional area. And the court decided in this case, we're not going to ask that demography question anymore. Mm-hmm. All we're going to do is look at the original language. And if the federal government didn't intend that the reservation be disestablished, then the reservation still exists, and we don't care if there are 1 million non-native people now within the jurisdictional area. So,
is there a possible outcome that Native Americans in Oklahoma aren't going to have to pay taxes to the state?
Yeah, so your question was a great one, which is sort of, so what does this mean?
Yeah.
It means on the criminal side that the rules of jurisdiction change, and that's what the case was about. So instead of the state prosecuting Native people who are accused of committing crimes, the federal government and the tribe will. On the civil side, which is the taxing side, et cetera, the answer is probably under the current laws, not a whole lot will change. It could in theory, although again, that's a little bit uncertain. And so what's happening is the state and the tribes have been meeting, and they've been meeting for a long time, frankly, for well over a year, to figure out what the optimal jurisdictional share would be. So there's the least impact on non-native people, the greatest preservation of law and order, and that sort of thing. And so once they finalize that, they'll send it to Congress, and we'll have a statute that sets answers to the questions exactly like the one that you just asked.
Is there anything that would prevent American lawmakers from dissolving the treaty there in Oklahoma officially through like some sort of an act of Congress?
Yeah, so under U.S. law, Congress has what we call plenary power over Indian affairs. And that power would include the power to hold the reservation to be disestablished. Whether they would do that or not seems doubtful to me at this point. There's potential claims that would be a taking property, so there'd be a requirement for federal compensation for the loss of rights that the courts just recognized. But they have done this sort of thing in the past. It's been a long time. Mm-hmm. But in theory, that is one possible outcome.
Well, lots to watch. It looks like this is just kind of the beginning of where things are going to end up. Well, thanks for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for your interest, and thanks for all the questions.